Our last topic in this chapter, chapter 1, is ethics, and ethics in the criminal justice system. Uh, as you can imagine, ethics does rise. Think of questions that you just might have regarding criminal justice. The one that I've been asked numerous times is, how can you represent somebody if you know that they're guilty? Uh, I don't look at that as my job. My job is to, if as a defense attorney, I also was a prosecutor, but as a defense attorney, my job is to make sure my clients' constitutional rights are protected. And I particularly I don't ask them one way or the other if they committed the crime, because that's really not how I solve the problem at hand or deal with the case. But there's all sorts of ethical and moral dilemmas that can occur in the criminal justice system. Judges and attorneys, though, are guided. There's ethical guidelines that we as attorneys and judges have to follow. There's a code, a judicial code of conduct for the judges, and there's a professional responsibility code for attorneys. But think of some other questions here that come up with regards to crimes in and of itself. Should a woman be arrested or prosecuted for attacking her spouse after she was subjected to years of physical and verbal abuse? Should an adult woman be treated the same as a man who has sexual intercourse with a minor? A parent who attacks another person who sexually assaulted their child? Or what about the man who steals a car to bring his sick child to the hospital? Should these be kinds of cases that should be prosecuted, or the treatment of the individual should be different? Let's work through the different C's here. Let's start with the law enforcement, the cops. The ethics. Think about their position. They have the authority to deprive one of their liberty, right? When you arrest somebody, you are depriving them of their ability to live, and especially when they are then placed in a holding cell. You can use, as a police officer, they have the authority to use physical and deadly force in some situations. They get to decide who they're going to investigate. They get to decide how far to go with the investigation and how much effort to put into it. They have the job of searching for evidence and taking statements. Such things come into play like, was that piece of evidence in plain view? Or did you have consent? And was the force necessary? Obviously, this is a big area right now we're faced with in our country. The police and ethical dilemmas. Profiling is a dilemma. Should the police be able to use technology, tracking devices, monitor our cell phones? There's facial recognition software now, hack computers. All of these things come up. Should a police officer have to tell the truth, even if it means that a guilty person goes free? In the book, there's an example. An individual stopped for a traffic infraction, and the officer searches it illegally, meaning they don't have consent to do it or a basis to do it, and they find a gun, and it was determined that the gun was later used to murder 3 children. Is there any sort of incentive for him or her, law enforcement agent, to say, hey, they gave me consent to search? Or, oh, it was right there, I saw it, it's in open view. We'll talk about illegal search and seizure a little later on. So all of these things are ethical dilemmas, right? How about the courts? Oh, I guess I kind of ran through my courts without flipping my slide. I'll let you work through that one. For the cops, let's turn to the the courts. Attorneys are officers of the court, so we cannot, as attorneys, misrepresent the law, and we must disclose relevant issues as necessary. And as I explained, we are guided by the code. There's a code of ethics for both attorneys and judges. But prosecutors, let's talk about them. They have a very unique position, as I've been alluding to right along. They represent the state, right? If it's, in New York, I represent the state in New York. And in New York, each county has a district attorney. And the district attorney has assistant district attorneys. And they represent the state of New York in that county. They have to be fair. They have to promote justice. They have to be impartial. They're required to turn over evidence. They have to make sure that the law enforcement's investigation was legal. And if it wasn't, they have to take necessary steps to do what's right. They have to uphold the law, even though it is also their job to obtain convictions. They do not represent the victim. The victims, aren't their clients, but they do take the side of the victim if there is one, like in an assault case or a burglary case or a rape case. But in cases that involve, the public or the government, like counterfeiting or drug cases, where there isn't a specific face or a victim. So they have an interesting role that they have to play. Defense attorneys, the role is to seek to uncover the relevant facts and the elements of the crime, to advocate zealously for their client, despite, like I said, innocent and guilt is irrelevant. They have to maintain confidentiality, can't disclose what a client says. If a client says to their attorney that they killed someone the week before and hid the body, you can't tell anybody that. That's got to stay with you. So there are a number of things that a attorney has to do, a defense attorney has to do. Otherwise, when I say that they have to zealously advocate for their client and, protect their constitutional rights through the trial, if the defendant is found guilty, one of the arguments that the defendant can say is they had ineffective assistance of counsel. But we'll talk about that in part 3. More about that in part 3. What about corrections? The ethics in corrections. Punishments are what? They're vast, right? Doesn't end with the courts. You go off, convicted defendant goes off to corrections. And some of the questions that come up is whether or not it's fair or ethical to execute a criminal. In New York State, we don't have the death penalty, but in some states we do, and in the federal system there is. Is capital punishment a moral choice? We're going to spend a lot of time on the death penalty. Should people be given different sentences? Those are some of the examples I raised earlier, whether a man versus a woman sexually assaulting a minor, should their sentences be different? Should the woman who was abused by her husband for a number of years, when she retaliates and fights back or commits a crime against her husband, should that matter with having her charged, but even if she's charged, they'll get a lighter sentence? Is it fair to grant some leniency when someone cooperates? Helps, catch other criminals? So there are a whole different thing. What about technology? Using technology after the fact to monitor criminals who had been serving time in corrections but then released, maybe because of good time or something. Can you use GPS tracking? What about a CO who decides to issue a quote-unquote, they call them a ticket, for breaking a rule, right? Some of the rules that you can get a ticket for in corrections, if you didn't hang the phone up in time when you're told to hang up the phone, if you step out of line wrong, if you don't return a library book, those things can result in a ticket, as well as things like disorderly conduct, or you can't follow orders. Is it abuse of power? What about COs who beat on prisoners or ask for sexual favors? It happens. It absolutely happens. These are all ethical considerations. So the ethics, as we move forward, consider them as we kind of expand on these topics and the areas. Part 2 is going to be the cops. Part 3 will be, like I said, courts, and part 4 will be corrections. But ethics will play a role that will be intermingled. A topic I want to cover, it's not greatly covered in this chapter, but I think the media plays a role in the criminal justice system. Let me start with a story, okay? It's not my real grandfather. I kind of fabricated up the story a little bit, but it sells my point, I think. So one morning, after checking email, which is a pretty standard task, my grandfather writes a daily email. This morning, he discusses the violent times we are all living in and how murder is everywhere. He discusses how he worries about the future of his family members because the United States is a dangerous place to live. He often provides explanations for this quote-unquote increase in crime that, and now I'm interjecting my opinion, me as someone who has worked nearly 20 years in the criminal justice business knows to be untrue. Sometimes he will say, back to my story, sometimes he will say kids are violent because of social media or violent video games. Other times he will blame it on immigrants. Regardless of my grandfather, he lives in fear. He is fearful of someone breaking into his home at the age of 80. He had a security screen installed in his nice suburban area in Colorado. He avoids downtown Denver because of his belief it is overrun by gangbangers, quote unquote, another grandfatherly term. However, where could all these ideas come from for him? My grandfather's never worked in the criminal justice system. He never studied it. He did not attend college, but has such strong thoughts about policies that need to get enacted, problems with society, and he often states them as a matter of fact. So where do you think he gets all this from? The news. The news, right? Public knowledge of crime and justice derive largely from the media. Studies have shown the more crime-related media one consumes, the more fearful of crime they are. The ideal crime story for a journalist, this is what journalists are taught, by the way. The ideal story is you have an innocent victim that's likable to people, and the perpetrator is super scary and uncaring about crime. So every time you hear a crime story or see it on your social media feed, think about that. Journalists are being taught. This is what we are attracted to. Like they're being taught this because research shows this is what we're attracted to. The ideal crime story, the innocent victim, the female jogger attacked by the illegal immigrant. Remember that story? That fits this, right? The innocent victim, likable, and the perpetrator is scary and uncaring. That's the role. Who wants to hear about like a pot arrest, right? Murders are gruesome. They account for less than 1% of the crimes in this country, by the way, but a quarter of the stories on media are about murder. And to quote the media, a favorite saying of theirs, the news, if it bleeds, it leads. Most Americans think that crime is on the rise or at an all-time high. However, since 2008, it's been on the decline. Most Americans, 66% of them, report that they get their news from social media despite having concerns about its accuracy and reliability. 57% said they expect most of the news on social media as inaccurate. However, 66 of them report they get their news from it. Does that make sense? Convenience versus accuracy? Big question mark. Media wants to capture your attention, right? The more shocking, the upsetting, gruesome, dramatic, the better. Remember the story about the band of Mexicans heading our way to cross the border? That was media fuel fired that never really existed. And yeah, I'll just let you Google that one. I just leave it right there. But people are driven by fear. And what's the message? The message with the jogger, the young jogger who was killed by the stranger, that ultimately was confirmed an illegal immigrant a couple years ago. What's the message? Women can't go out jogging without being attacked. Is that true? The research shows that women are more likely to be attacked by people they know than a complete stranger. Another popular rhetoric, fear that immigrants are bringing crime to the U.S. That is false. So, one exercise you might want to try after this media discussion is go about your day and record every time crime is discussed. Note it when it happens. If you catch it on TV, it's scrolling along the bottom somewhere. It's on the news. You read about it, the radio, your social media. Every time it happens, think how many times you get a crime story in a day, how many of them you see, and then think about what the message is. So that sums up chapter 1, and we'll get into chapter 2 next week.